Hello and welcome back to Art Bites. Today we're going to be looking at tone. Tone is quite a simple visual element to understand, but it also is one that can be used to great effect in a wide variety of ways. Tone refers to how light or dark something is. So tone can refer to black and white and all the grey tones in between. It can also refer to how light or dark a colour might appear. In real life, tone is created by the way light falls upon an object. The parts of an object in which the light is the strongest is called the highlight, and the parts of the object where the light is the weakest or the darkest, these areas are called shadows. The areas in between those sort of muddy grey tones are the midtones, the middle tones. Tone can be used for a range of effects, so it can be used like it's been used here in MC Escher's work to create the illusion of form. It can also be used to create a particular atmosphere, like this work of Monet's, or to suggest depth and distance, such as in a landscape painting. Contrast refers to the difference between tones. So in this painting by Claude Monet, the lightest and darkest tones are quite similar, so it can be described as a low contrast image. This tends to create images which are more subtle and perhaps more calming. Whereas we compare this to one of Monet's other works in his Haystack series, and we can see this image has a greater or a higher contrast because the lights and darks are much more different. This creates a much more dramatic image. Before I talk about how we're going to create tone, I want to talk about the way we hold a pencil. So normally when we're writing, we hold a pencil quite close to the tip, and it gives us the ability to create those tiny swirling motions that are text. However, when we're working in art, it is often easier to hold the pencil roughly in the middle. So what you can do is if you move your pencil around to find the balancing point, which is around about, if I just move it a bit further, about there, and if you grip the pencil from that point, that will give you a much more fluid motion. If you hold the pencil much closer to the end, you can create much softer tones. Because when you are working with your pencil and using that very tip, it will be much gentler because you are not pressing down as hard. What we're going to create today is we're going to create a tonal scale. Now, tonal scales are quite a good way to practice using tone within artwork, particularly if you're working with a pencil or with paint. Now, to create a tonal scale, we'll have white at one end, and that'll be our lightest tone. And we're going to leave that white because sometimes when you're drawing, you need to leave things paper white. We're going to work our way through to the greys, right through to black at the other end. So having left one end paper white, remember we need to keep that white, we're then going to create our lightest possible grey. So I'm going to hold my pencil as close to the end of the pencil as I can. So I'm pressing down with the least amount of pressure possible. And I'm just going to start to fill in this area with the lightest possible grey. I'm barely pressing down at all. And I'm trying to make these little swirling motions rather than back and forth motions, because that will help to blend the pencil into itself. What you shouldn't be doing at this point is blending that with your finger, because what will happen then is not only will you get graphite all over your finger, but you'll end up with quite smudged work and quite inconsistent work. Once you've done that first, that lightest of lights, you're then going to do the same across the next box, and you're going to work that way till you've filled the whole box. And then after that, you will then go back over the top and build up a second layer of tone on top of that first one to make it slightly darker. Repeating this process, notice I'm bringing my fingers further down my pencil. This allows me to put slightly more pressure on, and I'm still keeping those small swirling motions because it helps me to blend that pencil into itself, so I don't end up with those really streaky lines that you often see. You'll notice you can see some of the texture of the wood coming through as I'm drawing from my table underneath. So now working my way further down the pencil, applying more pressure. And I'm just going back to any areas that I don't feel are dark enough or aren't consistent. Finally, working my way right down to the tip of the pencil. This is the point that I'm really pressing quite hard. There's a possibility at this point that I might start to break the lead in my pencil. That's fine, that does happen. But I'm pressing down really heavily now. But I'm still trying to maintain the consistency of my tone. I'm trying to keep it all the same. I'm going back over areas I don't think I'm quite happy with. So now we've got white, paper white, through to our lightest greys, right the way through to our black, right at the end. Our next technique is going to be scribbling. Now, you'll often get told in school not to scribble. This is one of those few opportunities you get to scribble properly. Now, to do scribbling to apply tone, we're applying a reasonable amount of pressure and we're leaving lots of gaps in between our marks and just building that up. And the darker we want it to get, the fewer gaps we use and the more pressure we create. Now, scribbling, when we're using it to apply tone, we can use scribbling to apply tone for really textured objects. So if I was drawing a tree and I wanted to get the texture of that tree, or if I wanted to try and get the texture of something with hair, I could use scribbling to achieve that texture whilst also achieving that tone. So in my final one, I'm going really quite heavily and I'm trying to fill as much of the space as I possibly can, but still leaving some of those gaps to try and keep some of that texture. And that is scribbling. So we still have our paper white, we're going to our lighter versions right through to our darker versions again. Our next technique is hatching. So again, we're going to leave the first block empty because the first block is always white, and we're going to start to work with these parallel lines. Now this is something you can do in pen as I'm doing here, so it's much more a flexible method than something like our smooth blending, which is what we started with. Like scribbling, hatching relies on the amount of white space available between your lines. So I'm going to leave quite a bit of space, and as I want to get darker, I'm going to start to bring my lines closer and closer together, and I'll get more and more of them. Because this is something you can do in pen, this is often a technique you might see used in illustration, perhaps in comic books as well. Also with cross-hatching, you'll get the same, so we'll be discussing that in a moment. So you can see as I'm starting to get my lines closer and closer together, I'm getting more and more of them in, it begins to create this impression that it is darker compared to those earlier values where they're more spread out. So our next technique is cross-hatching. Cross-hatching again relies on parallel lines, but as the name suggests, cross-hatched lines cross across each other. So we're going to leave that first space white again, because again, we're focusing on the white space in between our lines. We need to leave an area without lines. So I'm crossing my lines over. And just like hatching, as I build those lines up, I'm trying to build up more of them and trying to remove that space in between them. And as I try and get this darker and darker, I'll get less and less white space and more lines. Now with cross-hatching and hatching, your lines don't have to reach the edges of the paper all the time. Sometimes it's appropriate, particularly depending on the shape and the texture of the object you're trying to portray, to actually not have all your lines meeting the same ends. So some of my lines are a little bit shorter and a little bit longer than others, and that's okay. Notice as I'm doing this, I'm lifting my pen off the paper each time. If I keep my pen on the paper, I end up with quite a zigzaggy line, which I want to avoid. I'm wanting separate parallel lines. So that concludes our video on tone this week. So remember, tone is all about how light or how dark something is. Contrast is about the difference between those tones. And we've had 4 different ways of creating tone: smooth blending, scribbling, hatching, and cross-hatching. To keep up to date with our latest videos, make sure you hit the subscribe button. And as always, thank you very much for watching.